There are periods when we begin to perceive a very discrete inner shift, almost imperceptible, yet deep enough to change the way we look at our relationships. It is not a sudden break, nor a crisis, but a slow transformation that slips into everyday gestures. We notice that certain conversations become mechanical, that presences once familiar fade, and that bonds meant to comfort us leave behind a strange taste of distance. This change first awakens a quiet surprise, as if something inside were moving just a millimeter, yet enough to blur emotional reference points. We then wonder why certain connections that once felt natural seem to lose their vitality, and why solitude slowly takes up more space than expected. This phenomenon does not come from a sudden lack of sociability or an inability to create bonds, but from a much subtler inner readjustment, often ignored until it becomes impossible to avoid. Little by little, we realize that it is not so much the external world that changes, but the way we wish to inhabit our relationships. The search for intensity gives way to a need for sincerity, and interactions built only on habit begin to crack. It is not rejection nor new coldness, but a deep exhaustion toward exchanges that no longer nourish anything. The feeling surprises because it reveals a truth many prefer not to see. A large part of the relationships we maintain rely more on the fear of being alone than on a real desire to share. Of being alone than on a real desire to share. When that fear weakens, those bonds naturally loosen, without drama, without confrontation, as if everyone were simply returning to the place that truly belongs to them. What few people understand is that the lack of friends does not first reveal an external absence, but an inner transformation. This apparent emptiness is not always a sign of social deficiency. It often means that certain parts of oneself can no longer tolerate superficial relationships. When we stop filling silence out of necessity, the dynamic reorganizes itself. Those who were there to escape their own noise find no echo anymore. And those who remain without pressure open a space where quality finally prevails over quantity. This awareness can be unsettling because it forces us to face what we truly expect from human connection, beyond the reassuring idea of simply being surrounded. Yet it is precisely at this point that a more authentic form of relationship begins, one where we no longer need to hide fragile parts of ourselves just to maintain an appearance of closeness. Over time, we start to realize that this silent reorganization does not only affect the way we relate to others, but also the way we relate to ourselves. The absence of certain people, far from being a catastrophe, often reveals a truth we did not want to see. We understand that some relationships we once considered essential were actually built on old needs, sometimes even on wounds we never examined. These bonds functioned as temporary emotional supports, useful at one time, but unable to survive when inner awareness evolves. This realization may feel harsh, yet it opens the way to a new clarity. Being surrounded does not mean being understood, and being alone does not mean being abandoned. This distinction changes everything, because it allows us to see solitude not as a lack, but as a space where something more intimate can emerge. When we stop chasing interactions just to avoid facing our own silences, we rediscover an inner territory long neglected. At first, this calm can be disconcerting. It exposes buried emotions, unspoken expectations, the wounds set aside to preserve fragile balances. Yet it is precisely in this bare space that we begin to understand why certain relationships could no longer survive. Depth requires care, and relationships based on avoidance or distraction cannot endure once we decide to be honest with ourselves. This process is not spectacular. It manifests in small gestures, quiet refusals, and a strange fatigue toward what once seemed normal. We no longer try to impress, convince, or hold on. We simply try to breathe without betraying ourselves. This inner shift is often mistaken for isolation or withdrawal, but it is actually a sign of emotional maturity. What many do not understand is that this natural sorting is not an act of rupture, but of respect. Respecting our energy, our rhythm, our needs. Respecting others as well by not forcing them to play roles they can know. Longer hold. The distance that appears is not judgment. It is the logical consequence of an inner realignment. And once we accept this, solitude stops being a verdict and becomes a necessary stage, allowing future relationships to rest on truth rather than fear. As we move forward in this inner evolution, we notice that some interactions, once easy, become surprisingly heavy. It is not that people have suddenly changed, but rather that our sensitivity has sharpened. We clearly perceive conversations that go in circles, exchanges built on empty habits, relationships that demand more energy than they give. This creates a striking contrast between what felt normal yesterday and what feels misaligned today. This impression does not come from judgment, but from the simple fact that our inner space can no longer tolerate inconsistencies we once accepted without question. A quiet gap sets in, a natural distance that installs itself effortlessly, as if something inside refuses to continue functioning on autopilot. This distance raises a fundamental question. Why maintain bonds that no longer correspond to our inner state? The answer is not simple. Part of us wants to protect shared history. Another, more lucid, recognizes that staying loyal to old versions of ourselves prevents us from moving forward. This creates a tension that feels almost physical. We feel the weight of relationships that exist only by inertia, and that weight appears as irritation, fatigue, or confusion. These are not accusations, but signs we are exceeding the limits of our authenticity. Continuing anyway amounts to abandoning ourselves slowly. At this precise moment, many interpret the lack of friends as a loss. Seeing things this way brings relief. We stop blaming ourselves for inevitable distances. We understand that personal growth comes with a cost, and sometimes that cost is the silent transformation of relationships we thought unbreakable. Accepting this frees space, not an empty space, but a place where something truer can slowly arrive. And when we stop clinging, the apparent lack of friends stops feeling like a failure. It becomes a quiet indicator that we have finally stopped seeking outside support in order not to meet ourselves. And in that space, silence no longer threatens. It becomes a place where we can breathe, rebuild, and wait without fear, without urgency, for relationships that will be born not from need, but from truth